Well, how are we doing, everybody? Thank you guys so much for joining us online tonight at the Summit. It is good to see you guys. It's good to engage with you throughout the night. We're excited that you are here. Let us know who's watching in the chat section. If you're a visitor, you can fill out this Connect card here in the chat window, and just let us have the opportunity to get to know you a little bit better, engage with you, and share the story of Jesus with you guys. We're excited that you are here tonight. We look forward to next week. Remember, next week, we get to be back together in this space for the first time in a few months. We're going to be back together in person, and I'm excited about that. But remember a couple of different things that we can be excited about. You guys are getting a free hoodie. If you show up next week, you get a free hoodie. That's awesome. You're going to want that hoodie. You're going to love it. But also, next week, we're going to kickstart a brand new series because all of 2021, FBCW, our church, is running with this idea of making it personal. So next week, we're going to start this series called It's Personal. And we believe it's going to be foundational for you guys. It's going to share how you guys can make your spiritual life and spiritual walk with Christ personal. Also, how do you live that out in your everyday life, and how do you share that with your loved ones and with your friends? So we're looking forward to next week, but tonight we're going to wrap up our series Vibes as we talk about one more emotion that can control us and also deeply impact our spiritual walk with Christ and also our fellowship with one another. So as we think about next week, as we consider everything before us tonight, I just want to pause and pray over you and pray over this evening and also pray for next week as well. God, we thank you for this opportunity to gather together. And God, while we do anticipate and look forward to next week, God, may we not lose focus of what you are going to do tonight. God, may we silence our minds, silence our hearts as we consider your word and what you would have us to hear tonight. God, bless every single person watching and those who are watching later with opportunity to know you better and opportunity to share the name of Christ with someone else that they encounter this week. So God, be with us tonight. Be with us as we open your word. May your word be amplified to us. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Well, we've been talking about our vibes and our emotions and how if we're not careful, they can quickly take control of everything in our lives. And since none of us like being controlled by our emotions, we try to handle them, we try to monitor them, we try to get better. And as we continue this conversation today, as we know, we've talked about our emotions in general, we've talked about fear, we talked about anger. Tonight we're going to look at one more, and I have a question for you to consider as we jump into this idea tonight. What would you do? What would you do if you knew you would never get caught and if you knew there would be no consequences? Think about this again. Let me ask it one more time. Think through this. What would you do if you knew that you would never get caught and there would never be consequences? Now, whoever you're watching with, let them know what you just thought of. I'm just kidding. Don't tell anybody, especially if you're watching with mom and dad. Don't tell them what thoughts just popped into your head, because if for being honest, now I could probably guess most of us probably had some really crazy and wild thoughts pop into our head when I asked you that question. Probably some really wild stuff, and you're thinking to yourself, where in the world did that come from? I would never do that, but it popped into your head. The truth is, we all have the potential to think about some really wild and crazy thoughts. We're just smart enough not to talk about it. We're all experts at monitoring our behavior so that only the good stuff is seen for the most part. We do everything that we can to make sure only the good things in our life, the good things in our actions, the good things in our words are what is seen. And while we've learned to monitor our behavior, the problem is that we've never learned how to monitor our emotions, our hearts, where the emotions come from. Remember we talked about that last week, that it's really the heart is where everything comes from. It's important that we learn to monitor our emotions because our emotions have a big impact on the way we treat others, the way we look towards God, and also the way we view and treat ourselves. And that is a big deal to Jesus. So imagine I have a glass full of Skittles. Now, you think, Scott, why'd you not go out and buy Skittles? Well, I'll be honest with you. I am trying really hard to work out right now. It was a New Year's resolution. I just thought I need to get in better shape. So the temptation of having a giant vase of Skittles would be a really bad idea, because to have a vase of Skittles means you have to open, and to have them open, you don't want to throw them away. That's a waste of Skittles. I would love to eat them, but imagine this. Imagine tipping the container, this vase of Skittles over. What's going to happen? They're all going to come out. But what is already in there determines what comes out. Not me shaking it. It's what is in there that determines what comes out. If Skittles are inside, then Skittles are coming out. Shaking this does not determine what comes out of there. Shaking only exposes what is already there. The same is true with our emotions. They are inside of us. The question is, how do they reveal themselves? How do your emotions come out of you? How do they reveal what is truly inside? Which is why I think what King Solomon said in his book that we know as the book of Proverbs is very key for us tonight. It's an Old Testament book. You can find it in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. He says this: above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. We say it again. Guard your heart. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. What Solomon was saying is what is going on inside of you is very important. Why? Because what comes out of you, what comes out of your speech, what comes out of your actions, comes from your heart. We can all try to watch our actions, we can all try to watch our emotions, but if we're never actually taking a close look at the heart, we're just wasting our time. Because the real problem is at the heart. The real problem is taking care of what is inside, because good or bad, whatever is inside of you, listen, whatever is inside of you is coming out. Whatever's deeply wounded in your heart, whatever's deeply rooted in your heart will come out. And let's be honest. Let's be honest with yourself. Let's be honest with each other. We can all admit that we have some problems on the inside, right? Every single one of you took a self-examination of your heart. If you took a close look at what is going on in your heart and in your mind, we know there's some things that just aren't right. Most of us can quickly think of things that we've done, things that we have said, or things that we've thought of that no one else is allowed to know about. Those things that we keep to ourselves, the things we never share, because we all have stuff inside of us that's not great. And when that stuff comes out and when we do or say something that's not great, the result is usually a different emotion that ends up controlling us. What emotion is that? We know this to be the emotion of guilt. So tonight we're going to talk specifically about guilt. And guilt is a very loaded word because there's different kinds of guilt. There's actually kind of two things that we're going to look at tonight, two different kinds of guilt. The first one is this idea of false guilt. That's the guilt that you feel when you aren't guilty. You feel bad about something you did or didn't do, and you feel bad about something that wasn't that big of a deal. That's a false guilt. But then there's the actual guilt, and this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight. Actual guilt is this. It's the kind of guilt you feel when you did something you shouldn't have done, or you said something you shouldn't have, and when you hurt someone who deserved better. Feeling this legitimate guilt isn't a bad thing in and of itself. Listen to that. Feeling this guilt isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but it becomes a problem when something you've done in your past becomes your present identity and controls your future. Let's be clear, nobody likes to feel guilt. No one likes that sense of shame and guilt that they experience. So instead of doing something about it, when we feel it, we stuff it away. When we start to experience guilt, when we start to experience shame, first natural reaction is to stuff it away. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to look at it. And we have messages that we then say to ourselves about the things that we feel guilty about. Things like this: well, I wasn't the only one that did it. We justify it. Or we say, I was just going through a bad phase. Right? I was just going through a bad phase, so that rationalizes and justifies my actions or my words. Or the last one, which is very common in our world today, it wasn't my fault. We quickly just point fingers at everybody else. We quickly establish blame on somebody else and say it wasn't my fault. We tell ourselves these stories to make guilt less powerful, so we don't feel quite as bad. But here's the thing. When we make excuses for guilt or pretend like it's not that big of a deal, the guilt does not go away. I think you probably know this by now, but just because you don't acknowledge it, just because you stuff it away, does not make the guilt go away. The guilt is still there. And actually, we end up giving guilt more power over us. Think about it. Guilt creates a relationship between a debt and a debtor, meaning it creates an IOU relationship. Why? Because we have taken something from them. When we have hurt somebody, we have taken things from them. We've taken their reputation, we have taken their trust, we've taken their self-esteem. And so we owe them. We even say words like this: I owe you an apology. But the thing is, we don't see guilt as a debt to pay back. We experience guilt like a weight. And when we carry around a weight, it throws everything off balance. Carrying the weight of guilt throws us off balance, which explains why we can't, when we fix a relationship and make it right, we sometimes say, I feel like the weight of the world has been lifted off my shoulders. But that's not all. See, the other tricky thing about guilt is that it doesn't stay with the person we feel guilty towards. You may feel guilty about how you talk to your stepmom, but then you'll bring it up with your friends. And now the guilt that you've experienced in the words and actions you've done towards one person, now you are spreading towards another. And that bad mood that you've experienced between you and your stepmom is now influencing the way you are interacting with your friends and with your loved ones over here. It doesn't just stay with the one you hurt. See, when we don't deal with guilt, it grows and evolves into anger. The anger that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Anger at ourselves for behaving a certain way. Anger at not being able to move past it. And the thing is about anger is it doesn't stay inside of us. Anger always manifests and shows itself every single time. Every time. The truth is, we are all guilty of something. We're all in danger of letting our guilt become anger, and our anger turning into us being defensive or divisive. We don't like people pointing out when we may have gotten it wrong, and there's a reason for that. If we own up to our guilt and admit that what we did wasn't okay, we'll see what we did for what it was. And what was it? It was sin. It was sin, and that leaves us feeling terrible because we now feel condemned, we now feel convicted, we now feel judged. In other words, we'll feel bad because we'll see that what we did, what we did something bad and we can't undo it. That has now been done. Those words have now been spoken. Those actions have now taken place. We can't unsay that thing. We can't untalk that way. We can't untreat someone that poorly. Eventually, we realize that even though this thing is in the past, it is not completely gone. It's now part of our story. But here is the good news. You don't have to be defined by your past. You don't have to be defined by anything that you have done up until this moment. Nothing in the past can ever determine your identity now. You should not let it define you. You don't have to deny it either. You don't just say, I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to hide it over here and never talk about it again. Jesus offers us a very different and a very much a better way of no longer being controlled by guilt, no longer being controlled by shame, no longer being controlled by anger. And that's what we're going to talk about here over these next few minutes. So I want to look at something that Paul wrote in one of his letters. It's a letter to the church at Rome, and it's important that we know who Paul is. Before he was known as the Apostle Paul, Paul was known as Saul of Tarsus. And he was known for his religious zeal, meaning he was very in love with his religion and his identity as a Pharisee. And when the church started, when the apostles and the disciples started spreading the gospel to the unknown regions of the earth, Saul, before he was Paul, Saul took issue with it. He did everything that he could to stop this church from growing. He would go to people, arrest them, have them tortured, have them imprisoned, and even have them put to death. There's a story of him holding the coats of people as they grabbed stones and chucked them at people who followed Christ. He was doing everything that he could to stop people from following Jesus until one day when he had an encounter with Jesus. After Jesus was dead, after he was resurrected and ascended into heaven, he appeared in front of Saul, and Saul's life was forever changed. And no longer was he concerned about chasing down followers of Jesus. Now he was concerned about bringing more people to follow Jesus. Instead of killing them, he was bringing them to Jesus. Now imagine the guilt that Paul walked around with now. He knew everything that he had done. He had every reason to feel guilty. He probably had more reason than all of us watching here combined to feel guilty. Think about that. All the things that we've done. Imagine this. Imagine all the people that you have imprisoned, all the people that you tortured are now the people you are now in close relationship with. These are the people you are speaking to when you preach. These are the people that you are healing. These are the people you are talking with and walking with. You see every face in your dreams, and now they are here in front of you in the crowd, listening to you preach the good news of Jesus. But what makes his story as amazing is that never do we see Paul saying, I'm just going to forget about my past. Just going to distance myself from it. He doesn't run away from it. He actually owns it. Instead of hiding it or deny it, he doesn't make excuses. He never says, well, that was before I met Jesus, so it doesn't really count. No, instead, he told his story. He told his story and he owned it, and he wrote about it in his letter to Christians living in Rome. That's what we're going to look tonight. Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 1 and 2, Paul wrote this. It says, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ, Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life, has set you free from the law of sin and death. So in other words, he tells people that because of Jesus, something new has happened. Something new is here. You don't have to pretend that you didn't do anything wrong. Don't just ignore it. There is now freedom in owning up to God for what you said or for what you did. When you call it what it is, that weight that you are experiencing, that weight you are carrying comes off. You can stop running and you can stop making excuses. You can let all that go and live a life in freedom. How? Paul tells us, look at verse 3. For what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh. Meaning the law, that the law of man, the law of God that they used, all that it could do is show us where we got it wrong. So we look at our life, we see, here's what we just did, here's the law, okay, I didn't do that, or I did that. That says that's wrong. And it showed us what was wrong. It points out the ways we've messed up. But it can't fix anything for us. It can't take the weight away, and it definitely does not give us freedom. That's why Paul goes on to say this. For what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh, look at this, God did by sending his Son in his likeness, in the likeness of the sinful flesh, to be the sin offering. Meaning, Jesus himself had no guilt. He did nothing wrong. He came and he lived a perfect life, and he died a criminal's death on a criminal's cross so that you, me, and everyone else could live a life of freedom. We have every reason to feel guilty, yet Jesus has none. Jesus, when we were the ones that should have died, he died. And because of that, we no longer have to feel guilty of anything. We no longer have to feel guilty. We no longer be controlled by our shame or by our guilt. Think of it this way. Because of Jesus, guilt does not have to be the boss over you. Shame, guilt does not have to be the boss over you. You and I can now live guilt-free. Jesus took it all, took all the shame, all the guilt upon himself. It's like he's saying, bring all of your guilt over all the stuff you've ever done. Own it. What you did was wrong. It wasn't okay. We both agree that you messed up and you were guilty, but that's not the end of your story. Listen to me. Guilt is not the end of your story. Guilt is never going to be the end of your story unless you allow it to be. Guilt is not the end of your story. He's saying, I don't want you to see yourself that way anymore, because that's not how I see you anymore. I don't want you to see yourself that way. I want you to see yourself the way that I see you. And Paul wraps up this by saying in verse 3 and 4, and so he, meaning Jesus, condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteousness requirement of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. What Paul is saying here is that God has made the relationship between you and him one that is guilt-free. You are guilty because you did something that you shouldn't have. We all have. We are all guilty. We are all sinful. But you and I are not condemned because of what Jesus has done. And that guilt, the guilt you are carrying right now, does not have to define you anymore. Does not have to define you anymore. Because no longer does that guilt define you. What defines you is the cross of Jesus. With that cross that took away the guilt, the cross that took away the shame, all the burdens, all the sin, it has all been taken care of. Jesus took the guilt upon himself, and now you are free. Now you are free. But here's the thing. The way that Paul writes is very confusing. And some of you, as you read that, you're like, I have no idea what you just said. I don't even know what this means. I don't understand this. I get it. But I don't want you to miss this because it sounds confusing. Don't stop reading God's word because it doesn't make sense all the time to you. Not everything's going to make sense. But when you decide to take God at his word, when you look at the word that he's given us in his Bible, and he said, this is what God has said to me. When you take him at his word, when you trust that Jesus, who he says he was and did what he said he did, and he's going to do what he said he's going to do, a few things begin to change within us. A few things start to happen. The first thing is that you no longer allow yourself to be condemned. You are no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. No longer when you look in the mirror can you condemn yourself or punish yourself for something that you have done, because guilt is no longer the boss of you. You now belong not to yourself, not to guilt, not to anybody else. You belong to God. And God says, you are not condemned. You are not punished. You are not shameful. He says, my son took care of that. So when that voice of shame and guilt tries to weigh you down and say, you need to look back at it and say, Jesus took care of that for me. There is no more need to feel sorry for myself because I belong to Jesus. So that's the first thing. You're no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. The second thing, your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. Your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. Think about this. Meaning, what you did doesn't disappear. Your past, while yet you can't touch it, while yet you can't experience it anymore, it's still there. It doesn't disappear, but it does become part of your story. But the question is, are you going to allow guilt to be the end of your story? That's what you need to ask yourself, because guilt is not the end of your story if you belong to Jesus. Freedom does. Freedom is now your story. You may have some lessons to learn, because listen, every sin has consequence. And every single one of us will experience the consequence of our own sin, or we will feel the circumstances of somebody else's. And that hurts. But don't let the sin and the shame and the guilt that comes with that define who you are. Your past makes you perfectly positioned also, listen to this, to help somebody else. Because no longer can you punish yourself, define yourself, while you turn around and define somebody else by their choices. You see, we often criticize in others the very things that we're insecure about in ourselves. As we look across Facebook's, Instagram, Snapchat, and we see all the things that people are doing, and we become very critical, and we watch the news, and we start becoming people of condemnation and judgment as we look upon everybody else and their choices. Listen, shame and guilt, because of Jesus, don't define you. Shame and guilt don't define anybody else. Jesus does. And you and I now have the power to speak that truth into someone else's life. So instead of being critical and judgmental and showing nothing but condemnation and judgment, show love and show truth. Because the third thing, you don't get to condemn others for their mistakes. Your past makes you perfectly positioned to love everybody, despite their choices, despite their mistakes, and to point them closer to Jesus. So the first three, here we go. You're no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. Second, your guilt will remind you, but it will not define you. Third, you don't get to condemn others for their mistakes. And then fourth and last, you are free to make things right with the person you hurt without excuses or an expectation of getting something back from them. Listen, what you've done, what you've said has now hurt somebody. What you've done has now hurt somebody. When we've done something wrong, the most important thing for us to do, sometimes we think, is just pray and forget about it. All we do is say, God, forgive me, and we think that we are good. But it's not always good. It's not always good when we do that. Jesus cares about making things right. That's why Jesus came, to reconcile and restore all things back to himself. That person that you hurt, Jesus still cares about them. So go ahead and pray for forgiveness, but then go out and make it right with that person. Own up to God. Own up up to that person as well and ask for forgiveness. Whatever you took from them, whether it was their friendship, their trust, their self-esteem, own it. And here's the thing, it's possible that your willingness and your humility as you approach this person will do more than just keep the guilt from controlling you. It will allow them to deal with the hurt and emotion inside of them that they may now have experienced because of what you've done. And think about the empowerment that is experienced there, that God, through his power of his Holy Spirit, empowers you to own your mistakes, to own your guilt, and give it over to him, but also to go to someone else and to empower them to experience the same life-changing forgiveness you have experienced. That's a powerful thing. In fact, what if the reason you are here today is that you have hurt somebody, you've said some things, you've done some things, and it's now time for you to own it with God, but also own it with them? What if someone is waiting on you to make that first move of forgiveness, to make things right? What if it's the way forward and the way out of the weight that you are experiencing? Don't let pride, fear, worry, anxiety, insecurity, any of those things keep you from righting the relationship that you have with God, but also the relationship that you have with your siblings, with your parents, with your friends, the person down the street that you hurt the other day. Maybe the best thing that you can do is to let the vibe of guilt go. And the only way to do that is to humble yourself and seek forgiveness from the one that you have hurt. Now, I get that it's scary to do that. Been in positions in my own life where I've done that. Even as I looked over these notes today, I sat and considered to myself, who is it that I need to extend this to? Who have I controlled by my own guilt? Who have I allowed their guilt to control my own emotions? Whose forgiveness do I need to seek? Maybe today is the day you fully realize and understand that because of what Jesus did for you, you are no longer condemned. You are no longer guilty. Remember, guilt is not the end of your story. That's a powerful statement, so you need to tell yourself over and over and over again that the moment you sin, the moment you feel guilt, you need to own it and remember the guilt's not the end of my story. Jesus is. The vibe is not going to go on calling all the shots in our life. There's no room for guilt. There's no room for shame, embarrassment, and pride because of Jesus, all those emotions are now gone. As we head out tonight, I want you to remember and pass that same love on to others despite their mistakes. You're going to encounter somebody this week. I promise you, because it's human nature, because we're going to be tested. You're going to encounter someone this week who has wronged you. You're going to encounter someone this week who you have wronged. It may be someone personal. It may be someone that you've watched online and you're ashamed of the way you spoke. You're ashamed of the way you gossiped about them. You're ashamed of the actions you've done. Or you're appalled by their emotions. You're appalled by their actions and the way that they've spoken to you, and now you are hurt. And now all of a sudden, guilt is controlling you and defining you once again. Don't let guilt define you when guilt is not the end of the story. So this week, I want you to pray. I want you to focus on who is it that you need to extend grace and mercy to and offer that chance of forgiveness. And whose forgiveness do you need to seek? And don't let any of these things define you any longer. It doesn't have to be the boss of you. It doesn't have to control your friendships. It doesn't have to control any relationship that you have because Jesus has taken care of it all. I love you guys. I pray that you guys have a great night. If you're going to your small groups, I pray that you guys have a great time on Zoom. I cannot wait to see you guys next week. I cannot wait to spend time with you, to hear you all sing together again. And it's going to be great to be together. And I can't wait to see you guys rocking around those hoodies all over the Mid-Ohio Valley. It's going to be great to rock the Summit brand to everybody else who sees it. I hope you guys have a great night. We'll see you all here in a few days. Love you all.